thank you guys for coming out. This was a fun book to write. If you read it, you know from the introduction, this means a lot to me. Putting some of the stuff that I was thinking about on paper, and some of the concepts that I've come across over the years, just treating runners and just kind of understanding the sport and the world of injuries. And I often joke, I see the dark side of running often with injuries and just setbacks. And so this book is an effort to sort of, kind of raise the platform of education within the running community. And there are some novel ideas in here. And I will definitely want to flesh those out kind of before we kind of get into the Q&A side of it, which I love Q&A, by the way. So please, hopefully you guys have a book. Hopefully you can, you read through some of it and you have some questions, because, there's some really important topics in here that I think will help everybody with running injuries. But the title, of course, came from when I was just on a run. I was just like, what should I name the book? And at first, when I was sort of thinking about writing a book, which was many years ago, probably about 5 years ago, I think I was really throwing that idea out there. I didn't really know. I kind of it was sort of the original idea was going to be in the vein of Lore of Running. If any of you, Tim Noakes, if any of you have read that, has anybody read Lore of Running or parts of it? Because it's like, no? Okay, wow, that's amazing. Actually, it's a really thick running book, and Noakes was a PhD guy out of South Africa, genius author, and he had a lot of really cool ideas in his book. But he touched on everything, right? He touched on running shoes, he touched on running mechanics, on fueling, and I really just in nutrition, which is really another big passion of mine. So I kind of thought the book was going to be like that. It was just going to be like this voluminous thing and just have a lot of different concepts. And then I'm like, I'm never going to write that book because there's just too much. And then the industry is just changing so much with research on that. And I'm like, I just need to get a book out and just stick with what I know. Like, what can I just quickly shoot from the hip and just like buckle down for like 3-4 months and just wake up every morning and just do it. And so running form just came natural. A lot of things that I feel like I've sort of been blessed with is just the ability to sort of perceive movement and understand movement and just kind of quickly just kind of capture when somebody's running, just sort of understand what they're doing wrong and why that's wrong. And what's interesting, and I make this point in the book, is that a lot of times we're all sort of ingrained with this. Like I tell a story in the book where a patient was just showing me some video of her niece that was kind of running weird, and she basically was saying that her niece was being made fun of at school because she runs weird on the playground. And I'm like, I'd love to see a video of that. And then I saw a video and I was like, well, you should get an x-ray immediately because something's going on in this particular area. And they did, and it turned out to be cancer, which is crazy. But what's funny is the kids picked up on that, right? The kids at school were like, yeah, she runs weird, so they're making fun of her. But like they were ingrained with that knowledge of like, she just doesn't run normal. So you all kind of have this perception of what is normal, like what should running look like. And a lot of times, like, everybody's got to tell, you can see somebody coming down the track or the trail and you can be like, I know, like Susie drops her arm out a little bit, or, somebody kicks their leg out or something like that. And we all sort of can understand that that's a little bit different, and it's sort of a tell on runners. And even at the highest of high levels, people have a tell, and so it's not necessarily a bad thing. So what I wanted to flesh out in the book was what's right, what's wrong, what are non-negotiables. That was really the idea. I have a quote in here from Elon Musk. It's like, physics is everything, or physics is a law, everything else is a suggestion. And I love that because when we're dealing with running and running injuries and the mechanics of it all, that's a law. You're fighting against gravity, you're fighting against ground reaction forces. And so negotiating those variables matters pretty consistently in the run. And if you do the math on just a 5-mile run, you put a couple tons of force through your system. And if that force isn't properly distributed where it should be, then you're going to get injured. It's just a matter of time. And so understanding where should that force be put through and then why that matters more. So cool. That was sort of the idea of the book. So anyways, I thought the title was cool. I kind of was a little sad that I didn't hold off the title for like the big voluminous work, but I'll come up with something a little bit more clever. But the idea is literally that. So your guide to overcoming injuries and running faster than ever, because the very thing that actually creates an injury also slows you down. And it's just basically not negotiating these forces in the proper manner and losing energy somewhere. We all have watched the Olympics this past summer, and we all saw, Grant Fisher finish the 5K and the 10K, and it looks like he's jogging. because people like that, they know how to negotiate forces. They've kind of fine-tuned everything to what matters when in the form. And so it looks just effortless and smooth, and a lot of us think we look like that when we're running, but we don't. But here's some simple suggestions that we'll go over today on how to improve that. So I kind of start out the book going through, and then I kind of just want to flesh out some key points, and then we'll get into the Q&A side of it. But so if we kind of back up and go, what is running? So what's the difference between running and walking? And basically it's jumping from one foot to the next. So I have a little section in there where I talk about like things explainer, where you kind of break down running form. So there's a flight phase to running. So when you're walking, the pattern there is one foot is always on the ground at one time, and there's not a flight pattern there. So you're literally jumping from one foot to the next, and then when you're landing with a partial mini single leg squat. So those are just some simple mechanics. But if we kind of peel back a little bit from there, I always say to my patients, running is the most advanced non-learned behavior you can do. And I think I even put that somewhere in the book. Basically, somebody can be mentally retarded and know how to run. Like it's a reflex in your system. It's actually based on 2 key reflexes. So you don't really have to be taught how to do it. We just sort of know how to do it. But any of you that have had kids, you sort of know that the first reflex is the stumble reflex. You're standing and you kind of stumble forward. Basically what happens there is your center of mass tips over your ankles, and to negotiate that, you catch yourself, and then you kind of keep catching yourself, right? So that's essentially walking though, but not running. So running, we don't want to necessarily have a phase where we're catching ourselves, and we'll talk about that later. The second reflex is the triple extension. So basically if you're kind of walking and you step on something sharp, you can thrust off, right? You can triple extend off. And that's basically to clear the ground, from like scorpions or snakes or something like that. So it's really deep in our system. And these are really, really subconscious. You have no conscious control over them. They're way back in the cerebellum. And they're running on loops, patterns and loops, and to keep us moving with gait. And so those 2 reflexes mixed in with the idea of jumping from one foot to the next is distinct to running. All right, so that's really kind of interesting when you break it down from there. So when we're thinking about these forces, we have to understand those reflexes are ingrained in us, and we need to pay attention to them. Does that sort of make sense? So I kind of alluded that in the stumble reflex portion at the very beginning of the book. Now, so like I said, with walking, basically, or like if you watch a baby, they stumble forward over their ankles and they do that. But a lot of us, almost immediately, if you watch somebody run, so if you just say, hey, let's just go out for a 4-mile run, let's start, most of us will kind of pinch at the hips and then go from there. And we're always a little hinged at the hips instead of leading with the hips this way and then tipping over our ankles. So a lot of times, if you measured us from the side, so you have the ankles or the ground, you should be about 4-ish degrees forward at the ankles, not the waist. So a lot of us will actually pinch forward at the waist rather than the ankles, and that's a big issue. And one of the biggest issues there is that you're changing the way you're recruiting your hips, and you're changing the way you're recruiting your pelvis muscles and your glutes and all that, and you're overactivating the hamstrings, etc. So that's one of the biggest issues that we see. The other big issue is that we're not seeing, like a lot of times with when we're thinking of things from the side, a lot of people will kind of run with their forward head carriage, and that sort of is a big deal that I allude to in the book. A lot of times, especially if you're working at a computer, you think your head isn't necessarily forward, but it really is. When that's the case, your head weighs about 10 to 12 pounds. If you hold it far away from your center of mass, it weighs more. So it can be, a 10-pound bowling ball here is not bad, but farther away from your center of mass, it's more. So making sure that when you start a run that somebody can draw a plumb line from your ear all the way down to your ankle, and then you lean forward at the ankle. And so that's important. One of the cues that I put at the end of the book is you kind of want to feel like you're pushing forward, almost like somebody tied a lasso around your waist and they're dragging you forward. That's a really important cue that most of us can get out of, especially at the end of races. Your mind's eye should draw towards your pelvis as the race kind of comes to a close and things get more difficult, because what that'll do is that'll force you into this mode where you're pushing from the hip and really thrusting from there, and that allows you to garner a lot more strength and get out of this kind of churning that we do a lot at the end of races. Does that make sense? So understanding the stumble reflex understands like how we will often pinch at the hip and lose power at the end of races. If we see us at mile 1, we often look great. Mile 25 of marathon, we're all like kind of like this, and you watch people finish and they're all kind of keeled forward. That's a critical factor to kind of think about. So I just wanted to make sure we alluded on that. we'll get to some of the novel ideas here soon. Now, one of the other things going back to the reflexes is the triple extension. So that's basically pushing off, right? So a lot of us, sit for, mostly throughout the day. White collar jobs will obviously do that to you. So you're going to be tight in the front of the hip. Not only does that limit your extension of the hip, which dictates how far you jump from one foot to the next, and Hazen brought up a really good point that we'll kind of flesh out later with that. But a lot of times what that'll do is through reciprocal inhibition, it'll shut off your glutes. And so most of the injuries that we see in the clinic are hip-driven, hamstring-driven, and that's not because the hamstring's weak. It doesn't really have anything to do with that. It's one of my qualms with the industry. It really has to do with your body is just over-recruiting your hamstring. And if you stand there...
I don't make these shoes, Leo. I just sell them.
If you're standing there and you put your hands right here under your glutes, and then you even just tip forward just a little bit, just a smidge, your hamstring fires like instantly. So that will steady your pelvis back. So that's why a lot of people end up with crazy chronic hamstring issues. They're not understanding the dynamics of what the pelvis is doing.
Why is it called triple before you keep going?
1, 2, 3. So you're extending the hip, extending the knee, extending the ankle at the same time. One of the novel concepts in the book is that when we transition from triple extension to triple flexion forward, is that this by far is one of the biggest issues I see in our industry, is that if we're here, what you want to do, you want to make sure that, so this is the part of the book, if anybody read it, where I'm talking about two-phase versus single-phase leg carry or swing mechanics. So most people, I was just watching a video on Instagram of a pro runner doing this today. Like if you're here, most people will bend the knee to shorten the lever and then swing the hip forward, and that's two phases. So most of us are bending and then driving forward. We bend because a shortened lever is easier to swing in space versus a long lever. Like this is harder to swing in space versus this. So your brain is struggling with the muscular activation around the pelvis to get the leg from here straight in one foul swoop, which is the way it should be done. So you're shortening and then you swing forward. So you'll see this delayed stance phase where when your leg lands, the swing leg should be in front of the stance leg. So if you're doing filming on somebody, when somebody's fully on one leg, oftentimes you'll see their swing leg behind it. That's bad. That you're always going to have struggles with that. You want to have your stance leg already in front of your swing leg. You can do that, and this is the critical point, by right when you push off, you activate your tibia anterior, which is the shin muscle, drawing your toes up towards your shin, and then that reflexively snaps the hip forward, and you get this single mechanics here. Now, a lot of times if you watch somebody from the back, they'll push off and their leg will kind of do this, what we call wagging the tail, where the leg maybe swings a little bit in or swings a little bit out, and especially at the end of races. But if you're doing it right, it just snaps forward because you don't have enough time to do this circuitous motion to bring the leg forward. Does that make sense? So that's the hack. So everybody, when you're running, you should literally feel your tibia anterior fire like crazy. And a lot of coaches have figured this out, that they can fix a lot of their athletes' injuries by just doing toe raises, like basically bringing the toes to the shin. What that's doing is that's neurologically waking up that muscle group, so that way when you're running, you know to activate that. Okay, does that make sense? So that means that when we push off, immediately the toe comes to the shin, and then it stays to the shin the whole time. Now the added advantage of this is it pre-tenses the calf and the Achilles. So if you draw your toe to your shin, you can feel your Achilles tighten. So now all of a sudden we have a pre-tensed Achilles, so when we land, that just pops right off. So a lot of times right when people are landing, their foot will be relaxed. Now all of a sudden what has to happen is right when the foot lands, the Achilles has to draw tight and then snap back with force. And that's very difficult on that structure. So it's better to draw rubber band tight, hold it, and then just let it go, because then it's free energy. So really, really critical concept. So I really want you guys to think about that and understand it. And there's some pictures in the book to sort of allude to that. That will also kind of get you out of this dreaded check mark sign that I talk about, which a lot of people kind of revert to that as like heel striking, but you can have a check mark sign without a heel strike. That basically just means that you're right before contact, your foot is in this check mark sign, which means that you're not landing on your center of mass. Part of the reason why that's the case is you're not getting your leg forward quick enough to allow it to snap down with enough time. So if your leg's way back here on the stance leg, now all of a sudden you don't have enough time to drop it. Okay, it's just simple physics with that. So the quicker you get your leg up into this accordioned compact position, like in this motion, then the quicker you can drop it down and get it under your center of mass. So when a lot of people are like, oh man, like when we talk about cadence, you know, we all kind of know cadence should be like closer to 180, 170, 180. Now, when we talk about cadence, a lot of people are like, I can't improve my cadence, and they're not thinking about the drawing the leg up in that manner because they're kind of wasting time back here. They're trying to think about like snapping it through in a different sort of way. But it's just like when you snap a towel, you just want to be really efficient with the movement. So accordion up, and it allows you to just come down with more force. Now, when you're coming down with that force, one of the other critical concepts is that if we go to the end of the book, on Q21, this is probably one of the most important points I make, is, I'll just read it here. It's at the last chapter of the book. Correct sequence of muscle contraction. In order to run properly, we must emphasize and visualize contractions of the glute max during push-off into the flight phase. I'll describe that. Hip flexors for driving the swing leg forward, and the hamstring and tib anterior just before the landing phase. So what this means is, when you're pushing off, that's primarily glute. Right as you're leaving that phase, immediately thinking about hip flexor and tib anterior, or shin, bringing you here, and then right before you're about to strike the ground, hamstring, which is a weird idea because most people are thinking that hamstrings evolved in extension, and I understand that, and most people are also, so if we kind of back up about hamstrings should only, in my opinion, should only really be active from here to there. But if we go back to the two-phased leg swing, a lot of people's hamstrings are active here to bend the knee before they drive it up. So that's now all of a sudden the hamstring is active in two phases. And then a lot of times it'll actually be active on push-off because the glutes are shutting off. So that'll make it so that the hamstrings are often activated in three phases of running. So they should be activated here. They are often activated here, and they are often activated on push-off, which is not great because if you look at a diagram of the hamstrings, they're just a small, tenuous muscle. They're not very big at all. They're not designed for any loading. They're guide wires. So when you're here, they just need to be guiding your leg down on impact. So if you looked at like sprinting photos, when they're like really, their leg is like really high up and they're coming through here, they're ripped behind the leg because they're snapping down with all this force. And that foot is landing directly under their center mass. So you need to like literally like think about the hamstrings whipping that leg down. And this mechanically makes sense because that's how we strike a nail. So if you have a nail here, all the force is created prior to striking the nail, and then you get that free energy on the kickback. But most of us, when we run, we think about pushing off this way, that all the force is on the push off. That would be like striking a nail like this. And that's weird, right? That's the reverse pattern. You want to have the energy prior to contact so that you kick back with all that free energy. Does that make sense? So when we think of it that way, that's one of the ways that it looks like they're jogging the Olympics. They're literally here and they're snapping down with so much force, and the leg just comes through there, and then they just pop off with all this free energy. The other advantage of this is that counteraction movement develops tendons at a higher rate. So if you think about the bulk of if we look at the front of the body, there's not a lot of tendons here. If we look at the back of our body, there's a ton of tendons. This is a really interesting concept. The back of our body, we think of the Achilles. We have the long tenuous hamstring tendon up here and behind the knee. There's a ton of tendons behind the knee. When you have this motion, these are guide wires. They're designed to basically pull you down this way, not create force. And that's a really, really important concept because once you draw a tendon tight, it can just snap back with all this free energy. Does that make sense? Cool. That's a really, really important concept. And then obviously, please, if you have questions with regards to that, just kind of keep in the back of your head. We'll flesh it out. One of the other things, I talk about arm carriage. We can kind of go through that. But one of the other things I wanted to allude to is that there is there are distinct body types for running. and I went through a lecture at the coaches clinic a couple weekends ago. I went through a lecture on this. There are basically a couple different hip types that can determine what sort of exercises you should be doing. There are joint mechanics in terms of basically how flexible are you. So I kind of go through that. But we go through the 9-point flexibility test, which puts you on a scale of range of motion. This is basically in there to help you understand what ancillary activities you should be doing. So basically the 9-point flexibility test, when you're on that scale, if you have 9 points, then that means that you're more flexible and you should be doing more strength training, plyometrics, sort of things to kind of tighten up the body. If you're 0 or 1 on this scale, that means you should be like doing a lot of like yoga and range of motion to kind of help you get in that middle range, that sort of bell curve range on range of motion. And what I mean by this is joint capsule integrity is purely genetic. What I mean is, if we take the pinky here, the pinky is, the joint capsule that kind of holds this bone to this bone is made up of collagen and elastin. Okay? So elastin is just like it sounds. Anatomists are very literal people, so it's elastic. Collagen is very durable. It's kind of the Kevlar of the body. So if I bring my pinky back, can you see how flexible my pinky is there? Now some of you go and try that. Just kind of bend it back. So some people probably can't bend it very much. So Monica's got a very stiff pinky there. So see how mine kind of really bends back crazy? And some are very stiff. So what that means is that is how your hip works. That is how your low back facet joints work. That's how your ankle mechanics work. If your joints are naturally super flexible, like what muscle is tight here for me to nothing. This is all joint capsule that I'm challenging here. So this flexibility test is a really unique way for us to sort of understand our own body and get out of the haze of should I stretch or should I not stretch, and is strength training good for running? Like, it sort of answers all these questions. So I encourage you, when you go through that section of body types, to understand where you're at on that flexibility scale, and then I walk you through what to do if you're on that scale. If you're basically a 0 or 1 or 8 or 9. If you're in the middle, then you do a balance of the two. Okay. Then I talk a lot about tendon density, and I talk a lot about fascial density, and so some different tests to sort of help out with that. But basically, those are just kind of ways for you to understand, treating running injuries is very hard to do, right? Because there's a lot of forces involved, and the way the body adapts is very interesting. But understanding where you're coming from with regards to some of these genetic variables will predispose you to certain injuries. It's the reason why some people can run 150 miles a week and some people can barely run 20. There are mechanical reasons for that. And ones as we can see with the success of a lot of different athletes, it's not like, it's not bad if you can only run 30 or 40 miles a week and get injured. It's not bad. It's just who you are. You need to understand that and meet your body where it's at and negotiate those variables accordingly. So, I think this sort of disarms everybody's frustration with the Strava world and kind of matching mileage, and so-and-so's running these workouts and I should be able to do these workouts too. And it's like, I've always known this to be true in my own running, because if I was running at a competitive level in the Strava era, it would be very boring. I interviewed Anthony Camerari a couple weeks ago, and on the podcast, he's like, yeah, I'm actually really proud that my Strava is pretty lame, to be honest with you, because he runs really, really fast. He just ran 740 in 3K. He runs fast. He's going to run 13:15 next week, I think. So this guy's legit, right? But his Strava is like, if you watched it, you're like, that's actually not all that impressive. So he likes that because he understands at this stage in the game what he needs from a musculoskeletal standpoint and from a training standpoint. And so oftentimes, we've gone through all this stuff with him, and we've made sure that he's very understanding of all these concepts and what his body should handle. So that's kind of like a good example of that. Then I also tell the story in the book about bone density. And so that's a really interesting concept where a lot of us, if we think of, and I talk about Clayton Murphy, and I talk about a guy named Peter Kostelnik. And so Clayton was a bronze medalist in the 16 Olympics in the 800. And Clayton has a very light bird-like frame. I kind of have that same frame. Like, you pick up his leg is light. Like, his bones are just not very dense. Like, they're just lighter. And you need that for that event, right? Because that event is obviously super high velocity. And if you wrap a bunch of really taut tendons around a lighter bird-like frame, that's how you get an 800-meter runner. Now, Peter's on the exact opposite spectrum. So I treated Peter one day right after I treated Clayton, and they were the same body shapes, and I couldn't believe how heavy Peter's legs were. Now, Peter ran from Alaska to Florida, pushing a baby stroller with all of his supplies. He did it completely unsupported. And so obviously you need stones for bones to be able to do something like that. You need like really dense frame. But he's only run 2:45 in the marathon, which I get that that's fast for some people, but in the world that Peter's in, that's actually not that fast. And he just can't move his limb in space that quick, but he can move it all day long. So he averaged like 70 miles a day when he did that, which is crazy. So Peter, he's not going to train like Clayton. Like he needs to understand that he's got a different body. So you just need to sort of understand this. And that was a little bit of a dig at some coaches in terms of understanding their own athletes, where I think you get this like one size fits all approach. And now we're sort of understanding it really does need to be not generalized, but very specific to what you're having. And if somebody keeps getting injured, you need to really think about some of these mechanics in here, which is why I kind of talk through some of these tests. And that's actually one of the events that's the hardest one to figure out. Actually, in my opinion, the hardest running event to figure out is the 800, because it's the crossover of the two. I mean, you're a true 800 runner, you can get there in both ways. You can get there from 2.4, or you can get there from 15.5. And a true 800 specialist is distinctly different from a 400 meter runner and a 1500 meter runner. It's weird. And you wouldn't think that. You think, like Hobbs is, like he can do the 1500 as well. Well, he's a really unique body type. And, but most of the time, that's why you don't see a lot of people bounce from the 800. They kind of just stick with the 800. And Shannon's right, because that's a weird event to sort of figure out, because the whole track world is sort of arguing, well, I know these athletes came from the 2 and 4, and so you need to do more sprinting and all this sort of stuff. And then it's like, well, then you hear of cases where people just come from cross, like a Nate Brennan, and then they run super fast and become national champs in the 800, and they did basically just volume and tempo work. Like, how do you understand what's the right way of approaching the 800? It's really an event where you get this like crazy meshing of ideas, and it's very like political now, where people are just sort of arguing what's better. And the case I was making there is that, in that lecture, is that the answer is the body types, right? When you understand hip mechanics and the difference in hip mechanics, then you can figure out, well, a sprinter body type would obviously want to do more 2-4 kind of work. And then a distance runner body type would want to do more of your 5K style work. And then they'll get both to the 800 at two different ways. Does that make sense? So that's really one of those events where I think a lot of people kind of need to sort of flesh out some of these ideas. So at this point, I think it's time for us to kind of bounce out to some Q&A, because I think this will be kind of fun. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Just talking about body types and stuff for 800 meters.
Mm-hmm.
What about like an ultra marathoner?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
is that body type or mental fortitude that pushes them through 200 miles?
So I always joke long is the new fast, right? Because long, you're right, like the majority of the ability to perform long events like 24-hour runs or 100 milers is obviously mostly mental. There's no denying that. However, some people can do it and they can run 100 hundreds in their lifetime, and some people run one and they're wrecked. And so that comes down to body types, right? And here I kind of talk about different running styles. So if you have somebody who has a ton of tendons and they're very wiry, and like a Clayton, and you ask them to run, they're like very like sprinter, like they're all just bouncing like crazy. Like I often joke, like Clayton's heels maybe touch the ground like twice a year. Like he's always like walking on his toes, and he's just like, it's like a weird body type. But he would struggle in the ultra because that's an inefficient form. Because actually studies show that if you're running slower than 930 pace, it's actually more advantageous to heel strike, which is not necessarily a negative thing, but it's actually slightly more advantageous to do that. And that's because you're spending longer on the ground, and you're actually able to fire some of the muscles around the shin a little bit better to protect the bone. So that's why that matters. So I would say, yes, the conversation about the bone density matters a lot. Do you have a lot of history of injuries? A lot of time ultra runners are sort of bricked, like they're very stiff people. They can handle a lot of force. Like if you kind of move their hips, they don't move very much. They're just kind of tight, and they're just, essentially tractors, just very compact. Yeah. And I want to do it. The farthest I've run is 50 miles, and I want to do more ultra stuff, but I understand it's not my wheelhouse, you know. But I'm still intrigued by it because I think it's very intriguing, you know, and for more the mind side of it.
Fascinating what they do.
Mm-hmm.
250, 300 miles.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like Pete, like he had like Badwater's record numerous times. He's had the Run Across America record numerous times. And this dude like literally ran like 200-mile weeks around Brunswick Lake, if anybody's familiar up in the Cleveland area. Like he just literally ran around Brunswick Lake for like 200 miles a week. It's crazy what he was doing. Just a mental giant, and his body was perfectly designed for it. So, any other questions? Yep.
You mentioned some really good ideas about how we can improve our running form. Do you have any other ideas to add?
Yeah, so I think like, I think that you should buy the book and read it because there's a lot of ideas in there. But I mean, in the end, you know, I advise like getting yourself on film and then wrestling with some of these ideas. And obviously feel free to reach out and ask me some questions, but it's more like, what are you coming into the picture with? Like you yourself or a client you might be working with or an athlete. And then, is it good or bad? You know, it's like, you know, a lot of times, like I was saying earlier, like somebody might have an arm flail. Well, does anybody remember Paula Radcliffe? Like the former world record holder in the marathon? Like she ran with her head tilted. She literally ran like this, and she ran like she was like chugging. But she ran 2:16 in the marathon. And then when they tried to fix it, she got worse. But what was interesting about that is she actually has a slight, and I know this, she has a slight hemivertebra in the neck where it is more advantageous for her to be like that. So that's automatically going to make her upper body tilt a little bit. Now, if she wasn't born with that, maybe she could have run slightly faster, but you shouldn't improve upon it because she's coming into running with that slight variation. So some of this is kind of natural. And I would say one of the easiest things, because that was kind of maybe a long-winded answer there, but one of the easiest things that you can do is do hill sprints. And I mean like legitimate hill sprints. Like 6 or like 8 seconds, 4 to 6 reps of just like all out, 110%, like as fast as you can do on a super steep hill. The reason is if you're running uphill, because obviously when you're running uphill, it's harder. It's harder because your foot doesn't have enough time to sort of make it all the way down under center of mass because it catches early. So then you're getting a bit more of a braking mechanism with it, which is kind of firing the quad at a little bit higher rate. But you will fix the 2-phase swing leg because you don't have enough time to let your leg kind of drag behind you because you'll literally trip. You'll actually literally trip. So if you watch somebody sprint up a hill, they will clean that back in mechanics every day of the week. So if somebody's running and their leg is like kind of doing this stuff, you kind of see them doing that, and you have them do a bunch of hill sprints and watch them from the back, they will literally not do that. It will fix it immediately. And because their brain is like, we don't have time to waste. We have to draw the leg forward immediately. And so that's why it has to be max because the brain is like very cortisol driven. It'll be like, oh crap, like we've got to run from a tiger or something. So it like gets very heightened. And so that'll change the mechanics of the leg. So I say like one of my favorite things to do is like year round, once or twice a week, get to a super steep hill, just 8 seconds all out and just full recovery, you know, just walk down, just full recovery. It's not about utilizing oxygen. It's not about, you know, any enzymes. It's literally just mechanical. It's literally just trying to get your brain to fire a broader sequence of muscles. With your gait, with your stride length sort of stuff, we can maybe allude to that. But what happens there is that say you're running a marathon. And you've done studies of this where over the course of 26 miles, if somebody has a poor recruitment pattern of their quads, their brain will literally consistently recruit the same portion of the quad. But if you do something like these really challenging hill sprints, then what happens is you're blossoming a broader connection to the whole quad to meet the demands of that. So then now all of a sudden when you go to the marathon, you have a better pathway to recruit a broader portion of the quad. So we find that you'll then fatigue that quad quite a bit less later. Does that make sense? It's sort of like creating a better dexterity of activation. So kind of a way to think of this also is like, say you play piano and say you learn chopsticks. The minute before you learn chopsticks to the minute after you learn chopsticks, you didn't get any stronger. The only thing you did was change the sequence of recruitment of the muscles around the fingers. Does that make sense? So now all of a sudden, one of the ways that we can improve running form is change the way our brains are recruiting the muscle. And then you can do that by getting it all the way to the hardest thing it can do and then work back from that. So I think that's one of the hacks. Yep.
Any suggestions on dealing with plantar fasciitis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from a running form standpoint, I would say that you definitely have to understand the mechanics of not lazily letting your leg land in front of you, that you have to overtly snap it down with force. And by doing that, by drawing the toes to the shin, like I was saying, when you push off, draws the toes to the shin, that pre-tenses the plantar fascia so that when you land, all it has to do is let go with force, and it doesn't have to do this quick stretch and relax. Does that make sense? If I took a rubber band like this and I went, it would rip, more likely rip than if I slowly drew it tight and then let it go. That's safer on a rubber band. Does that make sense? So if I kind of lazily let my leg land, well, the fascia has to draw tight and then relax. And that's hard versus pre-tensing it, boom, it just lets go. So now all of a sudden it's stored energy and it just lets go. So that's one of the biggest mechanisms you can do. And then obviously, from a physician standpoint, there's, you have to figure out the cause, exactly why it's happening, and then just kind of work your way back from that. But I think from a running gait perspective, that's one of the bigger things you can do. And so one of the ways to sort of clean that up is that hill thing I was talking about, but also the cadence. Improving cadence can be very beneficial for that. Last week when we were here with the podcast, studies show that if you have foot and ankle injuries, that you should probably get in a little bit higher drop shoe so it takes pressure and it shortens the plantar fascia and Achilles so it doesn't have to drag through a longer phase. So that's another thing you can do, is kind of run in a shoe that's higher than 8 millimeters. And then that's why orthotics are often beneficial for it as well, because that will also shorten the plantar fascia tendon and kind of provide a little bit of support so it doesn't have to stretch and contract as much.
Is it a slow process to heal it?
It shouldn't be if you figure out the cause. I mean, it should actually be fairly quick. Yeah, I mean, I think like online, if you read that, it would say that, but in my opinion, it's actually not all that difficult to manage. But again, you have to figure out the causes. So I would really suggest you to like understand that snapping through mechanics, because I think that's really going to be critical for that one. Yeah, so the point I'm making with that, so this is actually a really good point. Thank you for asking. So I have tattoos right on the back of my elbows so that when I run, I literally, my mind's eye, like when I'm late in a marathon, this is what I think of. My mind's eye will think about drawing my elbow straight back. And so I'm literally just thinking about just drawing the elbow straight back like that. So really the only muscle I'm firing is my back of my shoulder, my delt. The reason why this is beneficial, because if I bring my arm back like this in a short arc, which if you watch Africans, this is what they do. They have a very short arc mechanic, and then they're just very relaxed in the arm. It's not a lot of times you see people and they're swinging, they're kind of swaying, all that sort of stuff. We can talk about why that's the case, but let's talk about what should be done right. Now, sprinters are different, okay? That's different. So you're going to get to 90. If you're sprinting in a race, I get that. That's totally a different thing. But if we're really anything slower than an 800, like 15 up, this arm carriage is more advantageous. And so you basically want to have a shortened angle here, and you just really think about firing the shoulder back. So it's all about efficiency. So if I fire this back, what that does is that pretenses my pec, which everybody has tight pecs, then all of a sudden that just gently snaps it forward. So now all of a sudden I literally don't have to fire anything to bring my arm forward. So all I think about is snapping it, snapping it, snapping it, snapping it, snapping it. And that just creates this very comfortable, easy carriage. So if you stand up and then just drive your arms back and put your hand on your pec right here, you'll feel it just tense. And that's the mechanics. That's all it is. When you do that, that gets you out of this kind of swimming or DJ kind of moving that you might be doing, where you're doing that because you're not getting your leg through quick enough. So your arm is delayed because it's waiting to go back in sequence with the leg. Does that make sense? So if you naturally kind of get your arm carriage to be tighter and a bit more efficient, then your legs will sort of follow suit. They're kind of interesting how that works. It's like sort of gears to the body. Yeah, there should be zero effort up front. Zero effort up front. Now, I make the comment in there about Japanese runners, and a lot of times you'll see Japanese, Chinese runners running with their arms down, and they're doing that because they have really stiff spines. And so again, that's creating, basically so for running, you should have good rotational mechanics in the mid-back. So that's kind of one of the other points I make late in the book. Your mid-back is designed primarily for rotation. So if we think of golfing, most people with stiff mid-backs and they can't rotate, they'll dump energy to their low back and blow out their low back, which is what happened to Tiger, because he got so strong he couldn't rotate in the mid-back. Now, when you're running, if I'm in this simple mechanics, if you think like even the East African, That is because I have sufficient rotation in my mid-back. Now, a lot of people are very stiff in the mid-back, so they'll do this, and they're trying to generate more rotational force. If that's the case, if you're a runner that's wide in the arms, then you need to understand you're only doing that because your mid-back is stiff with rotation. So you should do like some simple exercises to literally stretch your mid-back to be able to handle sufficient rotation. And then all of a sudden your arms will literally drop because you're trying to helicopter them a little bit. Your arms will drop and you'll just be more efficient. But it should just be literally this comfortable. So they're just along for the ride. And it's a timing sort of thing. No, I think, no.
So you're more relaxed.
Well, okay, I get that. Yeah, so it's a lot of times your arm carriage is stiff, and so you just need to shake them out a little bit. I get that. But still, I would encourage you to stay really tight. Stay really tight. But not like this.
No.
Yeah.
Relaxed, but I can just hear my track coach say, relax and put them
I know, and that's such an interesting thing. And I still don't, and there was even somebody at the coaches conference last week lecturing on that. It's like, I mean, if you just watch races. Like, nobody does that. Like, if you're long like this, like, that is so demanding. Like, why would you want to do that? Like, this is so easy. The arm should be nothing. All of the force has to come from the pelvis. Everything. Your brain is primarily concerned with jumping from one foot to the next. So you need to, like, whittle everything down to that, like, small point. So, yeah, keep them short. Like, this whole, like, maybe, like, they were thinking, like, oh, that's what sprinters do, but that's a different thing.
But
like,
that's okay to do.
Yeah, to shake it out a little bit. Yeah, for sure. And that's because, if you're running a marathon, you're running for hours on end, you'll tighten everything up here, kind of shutting down some of the vessels, so you will kind of lose, a little bit of blood flow through there, so shaking them out is really good. But don't hike. That's even worse than what I'm saying. And a lot of times, like, if you watch people race, they're going to, like, hike their shoulders like crazy, and so you just have to think about anchoring down and just being real. And that's the thing, is like, when you get late in these races, you have to have a go-to that you have rehearsed numerous times in workouts and other races that, when things start to go south, you just know, like, John McDonald, the Arkansas coach, he used to always say, check your instruments. Do you know why he used to say that? So he was this famous coach at Arkansas. He won 42 national championships, and I got the pleasure of meeting him before he passed. And in one of his talks, he would say how he would always tell his athletes, so he would yell from the sidelines, check your instruments. And he would say that because in practice, he would coach the athletes on what things they needed to work on that last lap of the track race, right? Where do they fall apart? Where do they unravel? And then wherever they're unraveling and they understand where the mechanics go and they're kind of off, then he would coach them through that specifically. And then when he says check your instruments, the athletes know what to do personally for them. But if he yells lower your arms, do this, then all of a sudden everybody hears that and it benefits the whole field. So it's sort of genius. So I always think in my head, like, check your instruments. Where do I fall apart in races? Look at photos of yourself. Look at videos of yourself. Look at your athletes. What are they doing? And then discuss that with them. Literally have a meeting about it. You tend to do this. You tend to lean. You kind of do, whatever they do. And then just have them work on that. And so that way in races, check your instruments. So that way they're preemptively coming into it knowing that it's a race of efficiency at the very end, and whoever is most efficient will win the race. So that's an important concept. Yeah, so nutrition is interesting because it's like, that's political, obviously. Now it feels like, it used to be you can't talk religion and politics with people, and then now it's like nutrition is kind of in that same category because people get very, beholden to certain things. But I think one of the biggest issues that I see with general nutrition is that, if I'm going to say there's some easy low-hanging fruit that everybody can improve upon, it's one, eliminate processed foods at all costs. So that's the biggest thing. I don't think there's any lack of, media outlets right now that are kind of reporting on this with the dyes potentially being banned and conversation about pesticides and all that sort of stuff that's potentially coming with this regime. But I think you just have to eliminate processed foods, right? Processed foods started in the Industrial Revolution with the British wanting to keep workers at the factories longer. So they invented biscuits for the workers. And that's why British smell and they have bad teeth. I mean, I'll tell you that. And so it's just the truth. But that's sort of the start of that process. So at all costs, like, and even considering like racing, like in the morning of races, like just try to stick to natural stuff if you can. Then the other thing is try to avoid, try to eat as organic as you can, you know, because that's going to help you avoid pesticides. It's not 100% protecting you, but it will protect you quite a bit. And just be smart about, you know, what kind of carbs you're taking in. If you're taking in carbs, Google prebiotic foods, focus on prebiotic carbs, because those kind of carbs are really good for your gut bacteria because they're harder to break down. They tend to create a more flourishing environment for your healthier gut bacteria versus a simple sugar, which kind of makes its way right through the gut and just stimulates E. coli production and Giardia and all this bad stuff. So prebiotic foods, I would say really lean into those guys. And if you have a lot of gut issues, be smart about not throwing a ton of probiotics at it, which I know almost every physician will say just, you know, throw probiotics at everything. And my argument to that would be you don't plant your grass every year, you kind of just plant it once and it grows. So that's the way probiotics should be within the gut. If you have healthy gut environment, then you shouldn't have to keep taking probiotics. So if you consistently feed prebiotics, which is a different term, then you'll naturally stimulate good, healthy gut bacteria. So that's sort of the hack there. Staying away from processed, staying away from pesticides, and leaning into prebiotic foods. I think that's the lowest hanging fruit right there.
As runners, should we lean more towards more carbs than protein?
Yeah, I think,
Percentage or ratio there?
and again, I won't stand by any particular measure on that because I think everybody is different. I think everybody's genetic makeup is different. You know, my wife's Brazilian, and you go to Brazil and they're not eating a ton of processed carbs at all. They're eating a lot of meat and a lot of healthy sources of fat. So I think a lot of it depends on your upbringing and DNA and all that sort of stuff. So you just have to feel what works for you. And, you know, try not to obviously appeal to certain fads. But I would say as a aging athlete, and especially for females, you have to have a decent amount of protein. That is the non-negotiable. So wherever you sit on the spectrum of fat and carbs, the non-negotiable is protein. And the reason being is that your vital organs and your blood cells will repair, will take the majority of protein that you take in, and whatever is extra, then you'll repair your musculoskeletal system with. So say you need 200 grams of protein a day, but you only consume 150, well then you have a shortfall of 50 grams of protein. You're not repairing your musculoskeletal system. You're just not. It would be delayed with healing. So anybody that has like a stress fracture or a tendon injury or muscle tear that's struggling to heal, like have a bolus of protein, like really lean into protein because you will literally heal quicker and you won't gain any more weight either because what'll happen is, we know this from like burn victim research, somebody has severe type 3rd degree burns, you can give them like upwards of 10,000 calories even on bed rest and they won't gain an ounce of weight, but they'll heal quicker. The extra resources your body will use, and especially protein, it won't turn that into calories, it'll turn that into raw fodder to fix muscles. So that's a very important concept. So females should really kind of hang out like, you know, 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. Males can get away with 1.2-ish, so females actually shockingly have to be higher as they age because the estrogen changes the way you absorb it. And that's kind of a weird concept, but another perk of being a female. So, yeah, I know. So that's interesting, and I'll tie this into stuff in the book, so that way it's beneficial for everybody. But this is another one of my big qualms with the rehab industry, is that. So I think, so from what it sounds like is that you're getting some, you know, I would just by, if you're a patient, I would say it's probably 80% likelihood you're getting some deep tibial nerve impingement or some nerve impingement in the calf. And what's happening is you probably have a very unique calf type where if we analyze, I'm just going to raise my leg up, or pant leg up to show you, but if we think of the calf, so basically you have the gastroc up here, and then you have the soleus kind of middle shaft, okay? So think of these two muscles laying like this, okay? In between those two muscles is the deep tibial nerve that runs through there. And if your soleus gets overly developed or is overly developed relative to your body type, then what will happen is it'll close that gap and consistently pinch on that nerve. Now, a lot of times, in this case, what you have to do is you have to train the gastroc to get your brain to utilize the gastroc at a higher rate versus the soleus. Okay, so there are some exercises. If you go to my YouTube page, there's some very specific exercises that'll show you how to do that. But basically, whenever this sort of happens, it'll just get thicker and thicker and thicker, and then just pinch on that nerve, and then you spasm, right? So that kind of goes back to, a lot of coaches, or a lot of strength and conditioning coaches specifically, will have their athletes doing soleus strengthening work, and this is just absolutely horrific to me, because if you have, so I've treated a lot of really fast people, specifically in the 100, like 2 of the top 5 fastest sprinters of all time. Then when you look at their calf, like they got a really beautiful high gastroc and like a long Achilles. So almost no activation in the soleus, which is really interesting development. In those scenarios, you want so basically for running, you want the gastroc or this upper muscle here to be really well developed. And then anytime that starts to shut down from life, from being inactive or something like that, or just some muscle imbalances in general, your soleus will begin to take over. And then that's what traps on that nerve. You should never do soleus activation work. You should never do anything that's going to basically, that would be like, anybody that does like bent knee, like calf raises sort of stuff, like all that kind of stuff is just really a bad idea. Everything should be straight leg. If you're doing any calf raises, it should be straight leg. There's an exercise routine that I go through where you should basically kind of do this simple motion through there. That'll kind of help get the nerve to sort of floss through the gastroc and soleus region, and then thus strengthening the gastroc as well. So you kind of do that, and then at the end sort of bounce to basically get that Achilles to activate a little bit better. But my guess is you just need to, one, because you probably had so much trauma through there from the years of them spasming, one, somebody just get in there, just break apart the nerve so it can slide better. And then 2, just go through a series of exercises that'll change the actual orientation of how you're recruiting the gastroc versus soleus. That kind of comes down to that a lot of the mechanics the same mechanics I talked about, because you will fire the soleus at a higher rate if you land without a pretensed calf. So, and that's the drawing the toes to the shin. Yeah, so that's the cool thing about our brains, right? Like, say you were in the desert and you had to like cover 50 miles to survive, and this kept happening, you would figure out a way around it. Like your brain would like creatively figure out a way around it. We have all of these really cool like compensation patterns that can happen, but the problem is a lot of times if we're just running casually and stuff like that, we don't really, it's not sustainable long term. That's obviously not a sustainable running mechanics long term, because you're going to end up with all sorts of other issues. But to get through the run, then your brain has sort of figured out how to do that in a really unique way. But that's what I would attack for sure. But you definitely have to have somebody get in there and just get it loose. And not even like, not needling or anything, but somebody's got to physically scrape and cup and just mobilize and just get the nerve to let go. And then that'll kickstart the process of healing. So a lot of times the supplements will help you utilize the protein better. So that's maybe one way to sort of think of it too. One of the specific ones for that would be vitamin C. Vitamin C needs to be very prevalent in the body to repair collagen, which is mostly what you're made of from a soft tissue standpoint. So definitely take collagen, definitely take vitamin C, and then obviously, everybody should be taking vitamin D, especially this time of year. So those are all important variables. And then however you have to get your protein, and it's not optimal to have like, powders and stuff like that, but I get it. I get that, especially if your caloric intake is very low, then that maybe helps with that bolus, but it is always better to get it from a natural source. If you get, I just learned this last week. We had a guy on our podcast. The episode is going to be released on Monday, but we were talking about farming practices, and I just learned last week that if you get like good source, like truly organic but good sourced beans, that is like, that's not going to make you gassy, and that's not going to make you, ill from any of those perspectives. And a lot of people are maybe have some allergic reactions to some beans, but if you find a good sourced bean supply, then that can be like a great way to get the protein in as well. Especially if you're vegan or something like that, pea protein, beans, that kind of stuff is another way around it. Yep, it will. And I'm glad you mentioned that. So I talk about different running forms in the book, and one of them is some people kind of fall into a ultra form, and people are like, well, isn't that just running slower? It's like, no, so, like you guys would have what would be termed more of an ultra form, where you just naturally stay a little bit lower to the ground.
Everyone always laughs because they say if they're on a green screen, you would think she's the slowest runner there.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? But
exactly. Yep. She's just keeping things close to the ground. Now, what I would encourage you to do with the hill sprints is that you're going to bring your leg up much higher. So you're gonna basically train your brain to bring the leg up a little bit higher, which will allow you to come down with more force. Think of the hammer striking the nail comes down with more force. So if the hammer's only striking the nail here, well then your stride length jumping from one foot to the next is minimized. But if you come down with more force, you pop off with more force. So then you're going to jump farther. And that's actually more efficient. I think it was actually Vigil that kind of found this out. Was it 2000 Olympics where he was talking about Meb versus Gebre Selassie? Yeah, so in the 2000 Olympics 10K, Meb Keflezighi actually had a higher cadence than Haile Gebre Selassie, who had the world record at the time. Well, or maybe Bekele had it, I don't remember. But basically, Haley won it that year. Well, what was the difference, though, was that Haley's stride length was longer. So he actually had less of a cadence. Like his cadence was maybe like 4 or 5 beats lower per minute. But he was jumping from one foot to the next farther per foot strike, and that pays a higher dividend. And part of the reason why this is the case is that why does anybody know why we came up with 180 cadence? Like, why is 180 cadence the number? Like, why does anybody know that logic? So basically, when they measure hertz of tendon capacity to be able to handle force, it's 3 hertz. What that means is if I have a tendon in the lab and I try to stimulate to the max amount for its ability to be able to expand and contract with force, the maximum amount is 3 times per second. So what is that? It's 180. So the Achilles tendon can max handle 3 times per second. Anything over that, now obviously there's a bell curve on this, I get that. But anything over that, it actually becomes inefficient for the Achilles to be able to handle that motion. So you're leaving money on the table with that. So by having a higher cadence, it's actually, I get that if you're running like an all-out mile, your cadence ticks up a bit, but that's why it's harder. That's why it's an all-out mile. You're not running all out all day. Like that's why it's more demanding. Does that make sense? Because you're increasing beyond the tendon's capacity to handle the strength. So you're having to load the body with a higher proportion of muscle recruitment, and you're getting less free energy, which is why it's more demanding. Whereas versus a 5K, you're playing into the realm of the body a little bit more, so you're playing into the free energy of the tendon, so you're actually backing off a bit and then letting the tendons go through its full contraction so you can get the free energy, which is why a 5K is not as fast as a mile. It's kind of funny when you think of it that way, like kind of break it down from a mechanical perspective. But what I would say is those hill sprints will be critical for you because they'll teach you how to like get through a broader range of motion to be able to utilize the full breadth of the tendon contraction.
So just by utilizing that, it should change, like muscle memory-wise, it should change her gait?
Yeah.
Going through?
And then also shorten the arms. So basically just make sure the arm carriage is really tight, really short, just kind of compact, so that way the turnover of the legs is kind of married with that. OhioSportsRehab.com, and then just schedule an appointment. And so
How far ahead do you have to schedule? You're pretty busy, I know.
it's a couple weeks, so it's not too bad right now. Come track season, it'll be a little bit more.
Are
But
you going to do one day in Canton someday?
I know, right? I wish. But yeah, I mean, that's just the thing. It's like, I think, I think it's just important and one of the things I like to do with my patients, and it's obviously treat the way I would want to be treated, but you need to, I want to make sure that everybody comes out of each treatment understanding what body are they gifted with, like what tendon density, bone density, what should they focus on, what should they do ancillary wise, is yoga good, is lifting good, like what should I do with Pilates, how to integrate all these things and understand if it's the right stimulus for you. I think those factors actually play a lot more into injuries than we often think. And so I guess the case I'm making there is that even if you made the drive up to my clinic, you would come away with a lot of information that would be sort of a lifelong sort of thing. Does that make sense? It would be like a 10,000-foot view of you, period, which I think is a pretty cool experience. So it's definitely what I would have enjoyed. Any other questions? Awesome. Cool. Any questions at all? Yeah?
What was the name of the podcast?
Oh, it's called Mind Body Marathon. Basically, it's about like kind of just all health stuff, like mental health, like mind health, body health, obviously. But the take is sort of the marathon of life, like how to like exercise, live, like run, all that sort of properly to do this for as long as we want, you know. So like I said, we obviously talked about running shoes on the last one that we filmed here last week. So that's obviously a very important component of activity and fitness. But then we talked, like the one I just recorded was about, you know, the farming industry and understanding your sourcing of food and how to make that a better thing for you. And then one on Friday we're doing about running through pregnancy and understanding that and the research on that. So there's a lot of varying topics. So we're about 44 episodes in, so it's been fun. Cool. Well,
drleokormanik.com, so then you get the clinic
Oh, yeah.
website, the book website, and you can find like the podcast on Apple, YouTube, like all through drleokormanik.com.
yeah,
It's
thanks for
hard
that.
to remember all the different names.
Yeah, I can't sit still, so I just keep doing things. Cool. Well, thank you guys for coming out, and you know, I really I hope the book, I hope this helps you understand some concepts in the book, and you know, I hope it lands in the way that I wanted it to, in terms of helping you through your running and understanding your form and changing it for the better. But in the back of the book, I talk about kind of keeping in touch and reaching out, and if you have any questions, you can reach me on socials, reach me through the website and stuff. So if you have any questions in the future, just let me know. Thank you, guys. Yep. And then if you want it signed, I can do that too, because I know there's some people. Dr. Leo here. Be sure to check out my new book, Faster Without Fail, Your Guide to Overcoming Injuries and Running Faster Than Ever. It is now available on Amazon. You could read reviews on the Amazon. You can check out what other people have said about it. But basically, if you want to revolutionize your running form and better understand how to stay injury-free within the sport, this is your guide. Feel free to reach out and let us know what you think of the book. I would love to hear your feedback. But again, please check it out on Amazon. Faster Without Fail. Appreciate it. Dr. Leo here. If you want to catch me in another setting, be sure to check out my YouTube page, Running Rehab, where you will find exercises on how to stay healthy with running, how to improve your running form, and a bunch of other tips and tricks on how to get over common injuries.